Hello there, I'm Amira David. This is Boom Bust, and these are the stories we are tracking for you today. Deutsche Bank shares plunge after U.S. authorities slapped the lender with a $14 billion penalty, all for its role in causing the 2008 financial crisis. Details coming right up. Then Germany's Merkel says the EU is in a, quote, critical situation as leaders come together to discuss how to rebuild trust in a post-Brexit Europe. Plus, Germany has made lots of money in trade, so why are hundreds of thousands of Germans gearing up to rally against the latest proposed free trade pact? We've got that and a whole lot more lined up for you on today's show. Don't go anywhere. It all starts right now. Well, there are big questions ahead for Germany's largest lender after the U.S. Justice Department slapped Deutsche Bank with a $14 billion bill, all of it to settle claims that it had missold mortgage-backed securities. We're talking about a case that stems back to the financial crisis in which several big banks were accused of bundling poorly underwritten home loans, ultimately fueling a bubble of rising home prices. The U.S. government has settled claims with a number of big banks as a result of the faulty practice, including Bank of America, which shelled out almost $17 billion back in 2014, and Goldman Sachs, which earlier this year paid out $5 billion. Already, Deutsche Bank has responded saying it plans to fight the high penalties, saying it has, quote, no intent to settle these potential civil claims anywhere near the number cited. The negotiations are only just the beginning. But the bill in and of itself was enough to scare off investors, with the German lender's shares plummeting more than 8% on the news. Europe's broader banking sector also felt a pinch, falling more than 2% on fears that other banks in the region would soon face similar penalties. But the pressure on Deutsche Bank in particular has hit a new height. The lender is already struggling in an environment of slow banking returns and low interest rates, even signaling that it may need to issue deeper cuts in the future. The European Union is in a critical situation. That's what German Chancellor Angela Merkel said to the region's leaders at a special meeting in Slovakia on Friday. Merkel said leaders needed to show they could improve on security and the economy heading into future elections. RT's Peter Oliver has been following the meeting from Berlin, and he brings us the details.
Well, the summit in Bratislava was pitched as a chance to see what a post-Brexit EU would actually look like. What we are going to see, it seems, over at least the next few months is the Bratislava agenda. This whole summit started with what was described as a full and frank exchange of ideas amongst the leaders. When it came to the press conferences, though, it was interesting to see German Chancellor and French President Angela Merkel and Francois Hollande, respectively, taking to the stage together. There was also a strong suggestion in their joint presser that we may see more of this in the future. Chancellor Merkel said that security, migration and protection of borders were the top things on the agenda for this Bratislava agenda. She said, though, that the EU was still in a critical condition and that there was a lot to do. But at the moment, it wasn't about making sweeping changes to treaties or anything like that. It was about backing up words with actions. The French President, Francois Hollande, he said pretty much the same thing, saying Europe will move forward once its priorities match the priorities of the people of Europe. He also spoke, though, on a different subject about climate change, saying that all EU nations were now ready to ratify the Paris Accord, which would limit global warming to 2 degrees centigrade per year. though he did get right back onto message, though, talking about that unified defence plan. It does seem that that EU army, as it's being called, will start with France and Germany uniting when it comes to defence. He said, though, that that is open to all of the rest of Europe. Well, it all seems like happy families. As I said at the beginning, though, not everybody was happy. We heard from Matteo Renzi, the Prime Minister of Italy. Now, he said that he was not satisfied with economic policy and migration policy that had been put forward in Bratislava. And that's why he said he couldn't take part in the joint press conference with Angela Merkel and Francois Hollande. So Italy not happy with this Bratislava agenda, or at least what was discussed on it today. There are further meetings that will take place. There's one in Malta that will come up at the beginning of next year, but it all moves forward towards March and the 60th anniversary celebrations of the signing of the Treaty of Rome.
And now we move to Canada, where manufacturing sales numbers came in below expectations. That's despite the fact that the country's national bank continues to be optimistic about future forecasts. RT's Alex Mihailovich has been following this story for us from Toronto. Now, Alex, I understand that manufacturing sales came in at 0.1% for the month of July. That's far below the 1% that was expected. What sectors are being blamed today for that number coming in so low?
Look, we're seeing very modest growth, as you mentioned, 0.1%, even with some sectors or some industries performing well within the manufacturing sector. We know that 9 out of 21 industries actually brought that number to where it is. That accounts for 54% of the manufacturing sector. So let's break it down by industry to industry, give you a little bit better of a picture of what's going on here. So the July numbers, if you look at the food sector, up 1.9% to $8.5 billion. Then we have primary metals up 2.9% to $3.7 billion. Petroleum and coal up 2.5% to $4.3 billion. And then we have the other side of the picture. Now, here's a huge drag down, and that's the aerospace industry. Big manufacturing industry here in Canada, a full 9% down to $1.5 billion. Machinery, minus 3.3 to $2.6 billion. And motor vehicles, again, another big industry here in Canada, minus 2.5% to $2.5 billion. Now, these are the performances we saw in the first half of the year. A lot of people are blaming those Fort McMurray fires for dragging down the petroleum sector. And of course, some people are wondering, how come manufacturing, especially the non-energy sector, didn't go up with a weak Canadian dollar? So the Canadian dollar is low. Usually that means good news for us, but it didn't really bring the numbers that people wanted to see. In Ontario, a lot of people are blaming the provincial government. Our energy costs are through the roof here. We have a government that is bringing up the energy costs as some of the most expensive in North America, if not the most expensive. A lot of controversy around that, and some people are saying that that's the reason we're seeing these low manufacturing numbers.
Oh boy, not a good sign when the low Canadian dollar still can't sort of bring you in more money. What's being said about what we can expect in the second half of the year?
Well, the Bank of Canada is cautiously optimistic. It kept the interest rate at 0.5% last week. What we're seeing there is a look at province by province. We know that 5 provinces actually did perform pretty well. Quebec did well. BC's leading the team with a 2.2% increase in manufacturing over the summer, which is a good thing. Also, once we look into the non-energy goods or the manufactured goods, we're hoping to see better numbers in the second half of the year. At least the Bank of Canada is saying that it should look good. And of course, the oil and gas sector is something that is performing better than it was a few months ago, especially with Fort McMurray, if you put that into the equation. So they're anticipating that that's going to bring all the numbers up.
All right, that explains why the National Bank continues to be optimistic there. All right, Alex Mihailovich reporting for us in Toronto. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And it's no secret that defense budgets have taken a beating in the 21st century, with conflicts escalating around the world. But now we're starting to see the extent to which those wars are having an economic impact. Boombust's Bianca Vicini has the details.
The list of current and ongoing wars around the world is a long one. Aside from the brutality it brings, war can cause severe economic destruction to the communities it occupies. And that destruction is reaching levels we've never seen before, according to a new analysis from the International Monetary Fund. In the study, which looked at 179 countries dealing with wars since 1970, researchers found shocking consequences. Since 2011, Syria has witnessed its GDP fall to less than half of its pre-conflict level. Meanwhile, Yemen lost 25 to 35% of its GDP in 2015 alone, and Libya's GDP fell by 24% in 2014. And those numbers are much higher than the average. While most nations lose between 4 to 9%, countries in the Middle East and North Africa lost an average of 6 to 15% in just 3 years. Though there's more than just GDP to measure. If you look at Syria, over 6 million people have been internally displaced, causing poverty and unemployment to skyrocket. Then there's the 5 million people that have fled to safety in other countries, many of which are skilled and educated, leaving an even bigger hole in the workforce. The IMF has since pledged to amplify humanitarian aid in conflict zones and neighboring areas, and encourage others to do the same. But by others, the agency isn't simply referring to human rights groups. It will also take the work of governments, central banks, and private businesses to make up for the very costly damage of war.
Costly indeed. And tell me, I mean, how has the refugee population and the refugee crisis, how has that impacted European countries as compared to Middle Eastern, North African countries?
So there's certainly been a difference in the way that different countries have been hosting refugee populations. If you look in Europe, most countries have only experienced very small economic impacts, some of which are actually positive. But then if you look in countries like Lebanon, there's a very high competition for low-wage jobs, and that's actually pushed down wages. And that, as a result, puts more pressure on public services like health care. So there's really stark differences between the two, and obviously it's been harder for countries in the Middle East and North Africa to deal with it.
Yeah, and we know that, I mean, Middle Eastern economies were not in the best of shape, economically speaking, to begin with. So this is, of course, just adding pressure, unfortunately. Bianca Ficini, thank you so much for that. All right, still ahead here on Boom Bust, a global soccer legend gets hit with allegations of fraud, criminal mismanagement, and money laundering. The full story straight ahead. Plus, Germany has made lots of money in trade. So why are hundreds of thousands of Germans gearing up to rally against the latest proposed free trade pact? That is on the other side. Stay with us. And as we go to break, here are the numbers at the closing bell.
Earlier today, President Obama
Senate Republicans previously stated that the component responsible for poisoning people in Flint.
There's always hope.
That's what goes on in politics.
What are women supposed to do?
Here's something else we know.
Between the U.S.
Lawyers
and
at the
Cuba.
ACLU have already
Some degree of loss in business.
It's a huge difference.
Following the announcement, oil prices.
Nobody's talking about this story because it's garbage.
Real, genuine, and significant change.
Let's defeat her.
A man you can bait with a tweet is not a man we can trust with nuclear weapons.
She's their puppet, and they pull the strings.
We will not ban a religion.
We don't want them in our country.
We will not build a wall.
A great border wall, believe me. USA, USA.
Just recently, we learned that Swiss authorities were investigating German soccer legend Franz Beckenbauer over allegations of fraud, criminal mismanagement, money laundering, and misappropriation. This is in connection, of course, to his role in the 2006 World Cup hosted by Germany. So Ed first asked our next guest, Holy Cross economics professor Victor Matheson, what he could tell us about this case. Take a look at what he had to say.
Well, I think the big issue here is that it just doesn't look like anyone in soccer is clean. If you look back to the recent election here, we were hoping that maybe Platini would be the new FIFA president, but of course he's implicated. Soccer star Beckenbauer implicated. You know, up and down the line, it just seems to be hard to find anyone who hasn't been tainted, who has any position of power in FIFA or anywhere in world soccer for the last, say, 10 or 20 years.
Well, you know, that was the question I was going to ask you, because my understanding is that the money, allegedly came from Robert Louis Dreyfus, who's the now deceased former head of Adidas, and it was done actually way back at Beckenbauer's request in 2000, right before Germany was awarded the 2006 finals vote by a narrow vote. And this is, we're talking about 16 years ago here. So it sounds like, it's kind of like the alleged self-dealing that tripped up Blatter and Platini, forcing them to resign. So, my question to you is, behind the scenes, how dirty is the money part of the soccer business?
Well, I think the problem is we have just very, very long ties back to this sort of corruption for, it looks like at least a decade or two, and, maybe even much further back than that. We certainly have seen it really come to a head here in the last, say, 2 or 3 World Cup votes. Certainly the German vote, where they beat out South Africa, and then the South African vote, plus obviously Qatar more recently here. And again, you can't seem to find a confederation. You can't seem to find any of the national federations that aren't simply full of corruption. And of course, one of the big issues is soccer seems to only promote people from within the sport. If we had had a regular organization, say if United Airlines had a CEO that was corrupt, the last thing you'd be thinking of is putting in the vice president in terms of that in terms of that succession. They would find someone from totally outside the industry. But soccer seems uninterested in doing that. There's certainly folks like, just to throw out a name like Mitt Romney, here's a guy with a squeaky clean image who has a lot of sports history. He would be the sort of person that you might bring in to rescue FIFA, but there doesn't seem to be any interest in bringing people from outside soccer in to clean it up.
Well, that's interesting, because the Slovenian guy who we recently had elections to replace Platini as the head of Europe Soccer Federation, and a Slovenian has won. He beat out the Dutch guy who was going up against him. Do you think, even though he's on the inside, that this will help put some of the stigma behind us, because he's relatively new?
Well, certainly there's no doubt that he's an outsider. He has only been, so we're talking about Alexandra Sefer, and he's from Slovenia. He has only been in Slovenian soccer, at least as the head of Slovenian soccer, for the last roughly 4 or 5 years. So there is hope that he really is an outsider candidate who certainly hasn't been mired in the corruption of the last couple decades, and we'll see whether he really is a person who can clean up the act here in Europe, and maybe, of course, Europe could be a leader to clean up the act worldwide.
Now, I want to stick with the soccer theme here, but move to the English Premier League, because there's been a huge amount of interest generated by the record transfer fees that English clubs have paid to bring in talent from outside. I'm talking about guys like Pogba, Ibrahimovic, for example. But, there's also the addition of Jose Mourinho and Pep Guardiola as managers that's creating interest. So, when people when they calculate the value of a club, how much value do the managers add, and how much do players and the people like Ibrahimovic add?
So that's a little bit hard to figure out, but we do have some good research on this. This is actually something that's been studied by academics for a couple decades. And when academics look back at managing turnover in either in soccer or in any of the big 4 American sports, what we typically see is actually team performance declines when you bring in a new manager. Usually it's teams that are in trouble that bring in these managers, and the new coaches, new managers don't clean things up quickly. Performance is actually worse than you would expect over a short period of time. Although there is some evidence that if you give folks a much longer window, somewhere in the 3-month sort of range, that then maybe you see some turning around of fortunes. But if you're one of these big clubs that has just hired a new manager, don't expect a whole lot of turnaround here, at least in the first few months of the season.
Yeah, interesting. I want to move over to the U.S. here for a second because National Football League Commissioner Roger Goodell, he announced on September the 14th at the NFL they were going to be starting an initiative intended to increase the safety of football by preventing head injuries and then diagnosing and treating them better if they actually did occur. The league and the club owners, they said they're going to put up $100 million extra, including the 100 that they've already put in to support medical research. So is this a real breakthrough on safety, or is this just a PR initiative?
So I would tend a little bit more towards the PR side rather than an actual breakthrough. We are talking about a huge issue with concussions and traumatic head injury in the NFL. The NFL themselves estimated that up to a third of all retired NFL players either are or are likely in the future to suffer from long-term injuries associated with head injuries that they sustained while in the NFL. Obviously, it was not at all a good start to the season for them, as in the very first game of the season, we had the Broncos playing the Panthers, and Cam Newton have a couple pretty vicious headshots that were not dealt with by the officials particularly effectively. Cam Newton was allowed to stay in the game despite almost certainly serious sort of head injuries, at least in the short term, that probably should have been identified. Of that $100 million, though, they're going to try to put $60 million into making a helmet that protects players better. But the problem is players have gotten bigger and faster, a whole lot quicker than helmets have been able to protect these players. So I don't have a whole lot of hope for that. The NFL obviously hopes to stem the tide of early retirements as well. We've had players like A.G. Tarpley, like Chris Borland, retire after just a year in the NFL because of worries about concussions. If you don't get young players playing because their parents don't want them to play, if you can't get the top players to stay in the league because of worry about concussions,
It's big deal time. I'm sitting here with Ed Harrison on a wonderful Friday. Now, when it comes to trade, few countries in the world have done as well as Germany. The country is the world's largest exporter of goods and services. In fact, its export production will run up the nation's external surplus to a record $310 billion this year. So why then are we expecting to see upwards of 250,000 Germans this weekend protesting against the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, a proposed free trade deal between the EU and the U.S.? That's the question we're going to get to eventually. But, Ed, I want to start with this trade surplus because a lot of people are probably wondering how Germany arrived at this, highly acclaimed title. How did they really start running the surplus that they're running right now?
One is the currency, the euro, and the second is labor costs. So if you look at, and economists have looked at where Germany is, and they've estimated where they would be in terms of their currency were they not in a currency union with the likes of Italy, with the likes of Greece, Spain, etc. What they find is that in all likelihood, the Deutschmark, which they used to have as their currency, would be 20% higher than the euro is right now. So that means because they are in the euro, their exports are cheaper relative to where they would be otherwise.
Yeah.
The second thing is that companies have an advantage in Germany as a result of labor costs that have been very stagnant. Germany, basically, they've had really high labor costs, and at some point after reunification, that became a big problem for them, and the SPD party ran through these reforms, which are basically giving no wage increases to a lot of workers in exchange for hopefully good times ahead. And so for the most part, that exchange has worked out in terms of good times ahead, but what it's also meant is that domestic demand growth has been really weak in Germany, and they're very much dependent on exports in order to drive growth.
Yeah, now the German finance minister says that the ECB is really credited with being able to hold this title because, of course, we know the euro is much cheaper because of the policies that are in place. But I want to read you something that he said recently. He said, even before the European Central Bank decided its policies of unusual monetary policy, which also led to the euro exchange rate falling significantly, I said that we will increase German export surplus. So it seems like, he has always been really gunning for a much bigger surplus. The question is that supposed to help drive big growth?
No, I have two things with that. It was interesting. If you put that quote up and you saw what he was saying implicitly is, by the way, it's all the ECB's fault. It has nothing to do with any of our policies. It's monetary policy that has caused the euro exchange rate to go down. We were completely blameless. But this whole idea, really what he's talking about is mercantilism, which is the concept that you want to have this huge surplus. And obviously for every surplus there's a deficit. So he's really making the German economy dependent upon the deficit, trade deficits of other countries like the United States, like the UK. And the problem, of course, is in order for that to happen, it's not just the exchange rate, it's also the fact that labor prices have been suppressed, and that has suppressed domestic demand. And so, to me, that's not a good model. And when we had the recession in 2008, 2009, Germany actually was one of the worst to suffer. Their GDP went down by the worst in the Eurozone.
Now, I want to switch gears here and ask you about this trade pact, because now we have this on the table. It's TTIP, TTIP, whatever you want to call it. And Germans are, by and large, it seems, against it. We know that they have been very proud of their made in Germany exports. So the question is, why would they be against a free trade pact?
A lot of that has to do with exactly what I was talking about. It has to do with labor rights, but it also has to do with environmental rights. It has to do with consumer rights, and it has to do with data privacy. And just concentrating on the privacy thing, in Germany, they take privacy very seriously. And we've seen what's happened with regard to, after the Snowden leaks, that there's all this spying that's going on by the United States government into Germany. They're concerned that basically we will give corporations a way to weaken privacy and also weaken consumer rights. Monsanto, I think we were talking about that earlier in the week. The whole Monsanto Bayer thing, it's exactly the same reason that they're against that. And then finally, I would mention again the whole labor thing. They really do feel that Americans' labor laws are worse than theirs, and they're concerned that it will, given the fact that they haven't really had much wage increases, be worse for them.
Yeah, they seem to think that the downsides will outweigh the benefits. We're running really quickly out of time, but a lot of people say this is not a free trade deal. Is it?
It's not. I mean, if you have thousands of pages in order to get something done, obviously it's not free trade. All you need to do is sign on the dotted line and say, we'll lower tariffs. End of story. So this isn't free trade, it's managed trade.
All right. We'll leave it there. Ed Harrison, thank you for that. We love hearing from you guys. Tweet at all of us, Edward NH, Bianca Fascini, Amira David. Remember, you can catch us on YouTube, youtube.com/BoomBustRT. From all of us here at Boom Bust, thanks for watching and have a wonderful weekend.